Hey guys, it's Brianne from the Hoppy Doxy, and today I'm going to show you how to make this hot mess canvas, which is a peekaboo style canvas using Crystalac products. First, let's talk about supplies. So for this project, I used as many Crystalac products as possible so that I could show you how to make the sign using the items that come in your Crystalac kit. However, you can use things like acrylic paint if you don't have the pigments, so I will review those steps as well for what you can use in their alternatives. I do not talk about the alternatives so much in the video, so just come back to this to reference how to treat those different materials if you're going to be using them. So I used Universal White and then the number 2 and the number 5 Color Boutique pigments in order to get my colors. You can use acrylic paint in those steps for the colors that you want. Just make sure you apply it very thin. You might want to do a couple different coats and then give it about 24 hours to fully dry before you move on to your next step. And that's really important because you don't want to pull your paint up with your stencils, where you're not going to have that problem with Universal White as long as you give it the appropriate 4-hour dry time. I also used Extreme Protection to seal my sign. You can use Brite Tone in place of Extreme Protection if you don't have it. That's not a problem. And then I also used black gloss for the top coat. So the top paint coat. So in place of black gloss, you can use spray paint. You cannot use acrylic paint to go over it because it's too elastic and it will pull up your lines. You won't get very good lines with your stencil and it will just be very frustrating. I found that black gloss works really well, but if you don't want to use black, you can use Extreme Protection with the pigments to create a different gloss color for your top coat, or you can even use Universal White for a more pastel color on top. That will work totally fine as well. Just follow the same steps that I give in the video if you're going to use those products. If you're going to use spray paint, you do need to allow 48 hours to gas off before you move on. And then finally, for the Crystalac products, I used a little bit of silver liquid mica. This isn't necessary. I just added it to give a little bit of sparkle to my sign. You can see here, there's a little bit of glare, but there is some nice shiny sparkle in my sign. The next thing we need is vinyl. So I used Oracle 813 stencil vinyl, which is the blue vinyl. You can use Oracle 631 removable vinyl. I don't recommend Cricut removable vinyl because it is pretty sticky, but you could even use contact paper for this, just something that doesn't have crazy high tack. We're going to be sealing it with a couple coats of Extreme Protection so we don't have to worry about bleed. And then I also used a shiny pink metallic to get the accents in my hearts. This isn't necessary. You can just cut these out and do it as part of your stencil, but I liked having it. And then finally, just your materials. Of course, you're going to need canvas. I used 8x10 for this with stretched canvas. Just cheap canvas is fine. Dollar Tree or in the art section of your craft store. And then your basic supplies, I used makeup brushes, makeup sponges to apply my paints, but you can use a foam brush or just really any paintbrush, however you want to get your techniques onto your canvas. And then a tack-on brush or a fluffy blush brush, whatever you use to apply your Extreme Protection. And then of course some stuff to mix up your cups. The first thing we need to do is make the colors that we need for our canvas. You can use any color that you'd like. For this project, I used a few different shades of pinks and purples since I'm making a Valentine's Day sign. I found that using 5 or more colors works best. It helps to disperse the colors on the canvas so that you don't wind up with the same color next to itself. Start by adding Universal White to each of your mixing containers. Make sure you shake or stir your Universal White well before using. I used half a tablespoon of Universal White in each container, but I did have a lot of paint left over. So you might want to start with a little over a half teaspoon if you're mixing your own colors, especially for a smaller canvas like an 8x10. However, if you are following the recipes that I give you, you're going to want to add them into half a tablespoon of Universal White. I'll add the recipes for the colors that I used in the description box.
Make sure you shake your pigments really well before you add them to your paint. For the light pink, I added 1 drop of number 2 red. For the medium pink, I added 3 drops of number 2 red. For the light lavender, I mixed 2 drops number 2 red and 2 drops number 5 blue. For the medium lavender, I mixed 4 drops number 2 red, 4 drops number 5 blue, and 2 drops number 7 dark brown. And finally, for the purplish pink, I mixed 2 drops number 2 red, 1 drop number 8 black, and 2 drops number 7 dark brown. Stir your paints and your pigments well, making sure to scrape down the sides. The pigment will float on the top of the paint a bit at first, making it look a lot darker than it actually is, so make sure you thoroughly mix it. If you're creating your own colors, add just a drop or 2 of the pigment at a time, mix well, and then check your colors. It's a lot easier to add more than it is to try and take away or balance it out with more universal white. You can also draw down a small amount on a piece of paper to check your colors. I find they dry about 2 shades darker than they appear when they're wet. So if you're trying to color match something specific, it's best to check a small amount once it's dry. And if you're interested in different color recipes, you can check out my Color Boutique playlist here on my channel. I'll also link in the description to the Facebook page that I help administer, Crystalac Tutorials, Tumblers, and Beyond, where I have small batch recipes located in the files and a whole section dedicated to how to best use these pigments. The next part is my favorite part of the project, painting your canvas. I'm using an 8" by 10" stretched canvas, and I apply the paint to the raw canvas. I don't prep it with gesso or other products. You can use any tool that you want to get your paint onto the canvas, but I do recommend having a separate brush or sponge for each color because you'll be building them on top of one another, and it's just easier to have each one separate. If you're using makeup sponges, I like to get them wet and then squeeze them out so that they don't soak up a ton of paint right away. I like to start with one color and add it in small patches around the canvas, and then go in with each subsequent color, building them around the last color until the canvas is totally covered. You can feather out your paint a little bit so that you can kind of blend things together as you go. Toward the end, you're going to want to eyeball each area to see if it needs a specific color to balance out the pattern, which is where having 5 colors really comes in handy. And you can also build on top of your colors, so if you have a large spot and you want to go back and add a different color over it, the paint will handle that very well. Make sure you're getting your paint into all of the textured crevices of the canvas or you're going to see white spots. It's one of the reasons I like using sponges. Another is that you can use them to blend the colors together at the edges. But you can do the same thing with paintbrushes, just use a dabbing motion to make sure that all those nooks and crannies get filled in with paint. You can make your color splotches large or small in any direction or pattern that you'd like. Don't worry about trying to make the paint spots uniform. The idea is just to get the color down, and you're going to end up with a almost patterned vinyl appearance at the end with the peekaboo, with different areas of paint showing through. So again, don't stress too much about your painting. This part should be fun and it's pretty forgiving. Once your canvas is covered and you're happy with the look, allow it to dry for at least 4 hours. I do recommend, however, that you let it dry overnight. This will give the paint a chance to set up nicely and create a good bond on the canvas, which is important since you're going to be adding and then removing places of adhesive vinyl later, and you don't want it to pull up your paint. But as long as you let it dry for 4 to 8 hours, you should be good to go.
Our next step is to transfer our design onto our picture. And I've got some glitter on here, which is not a big deal. It's because of the way that the frame is, it's a good idea to find something that's firm that you can put underneath your canvas when you're transferring it, just to kind of provide some resistance. I don't have a book that's this size, so I just found this box and I will kind of move it around.
I have my decal cut out and transferred onto my transfer tape. I'm using Oracle Stencil Vinyl, which is Oracle 813. You can also use Oracle 631 removable vinyl. I do not recommend Cricut removable vinyl. It's probably a little bit better for something like this than it is for a cup, but it's really sticky and it can be hard to get off. So I've got it transferred onto my transfer tape after weeding it, and I'm going to place it. It's not going to stick super well right now because canvas doesn't take to vinyl all that well. So I'm okay to just move it around by hand to place it. You can of course measure it to make sure it's even and centered, but I just eyeball it. And then once I have it down, I'm going to take my burnisher and against the hard object on the inside, I'm just going to scrape it. It can take a little bit of effort to get it fully transferred onto the canvas just because it isn't the way that the texture of the canvas, it can just make it a little bit more difficult to transfer than something like a cup where it's smooth. So I'm just going to work this around. And I'm going to slowly peel it back, and it looks like it's for the most part going to transfer well. We're also going to be sealing this in just a minute, which will help to make sure that the vinyl sticks well. Then I'm just going to go back through and scrape it, make sure that everything is nice and secure. Now that this is on here, I'm going to let it sit for just about an hour, and then I will seal it with the extreme protection. And then another thing that you can do is use a hairdryer and just lightly hit it. So I'm not going to turn it on because it'll make a lot of noise, but just use it, a hairdryer, and just go over it until it gets warm and then press it down. I have a couple little areas that are kind of buckling up just because of the way that my stencil vinyl is, so I'm just going to snip them and then they'll flatten without the buckle. So I will hit it with a hairdryer, let it sit for an hour, and then I will come back and seal it with some extreme protection. I have the vinyl on my cup, and one thing I wanted to mention is that I did find that using the hairdryer really did help to adhere the vinyl. I don't know if you can see the texture in the vinyl, if it'll focus, but using the hairdryer, it softens the vinyl, and then you're able to press it down so that it really can kind of adhere to the different textures of the vinyl because it has that like hatched texture to it, I guess. So that really helped, and I kind of glossed over it. So I just wanted to make sure that we touched on that. So now that I've used it, I've used the hairdryer to seal the vinyl down. Now we're going to use Extreme Protection or Brite Tone, either one. I use my Extreme Protection for projects that I don't need like super strong protection of the Brite Tone, but if all you have is Brite Tone, you can definitely use that. And what we're going to do first is we're going to use this to seal the vinyl. Crystalac products are very thin, and then on top of that you have the uneven surface of your canvas, and so it's very, very easy to get bleed. I actually made one earlier, and even though I sealed it once, let's see, where's the big spot right there, you can kind of see
where the gray still bled. So what we're going to do is make sure that we do 2 full layers of a sealant coat. And because we're using extreme protection, we are going to wait 4 hours in between the layers. You do just want to focus, or you can just focus on the stencil area, but I just find it easier to apply to the whole canvas. But I want to make sure to kind of stay away from the edges, because if it goes too far, it can leave drip marks around the sides. So I'm just applying just like I would paint over the stencil, and I'm going to go over it 2 different directions to make sure that it really gets under the stencil. So what happens is that this will bleed. The clear will bleed under the stencil, so that any bleed that occurs is clear. You don't see it. And then it will also act kind of like a glue as it seeps underneath the stencil. It'll bleed and then it'll seal it as it dries. So you'll get a nice firm seal, like an adhesive. And that won't interfere with your ability to pull the stencil up. One of the reasons we're using removable vinyl is so that it comes up pretty easily. But because the Brite Tone is thin and it will stay lower than the actual vinyl, because we're only going to use 2 coats, we're not going to have any issues. In fact, it'll give us really clean lines. So I'm just going through, I got a little bit too much on this top part. Going through and making sure that I just brush it on, focusing on where my stencil is, the different lines, and going back and forth. So I'm going to let this dry for 4 hours, and then it's actually evening time for me, so it'll sit overnight. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to do it one more time so that I've got 2 total layers of extreme protection, and then we're going to put our top paint over it. So I will do this one more time, and then I will come back with you guys and we will do our black gloss shimmer over the top of this one. I have this sealed with 2 coats of extreme protection, and it has dried overnight and then 4 hours since the last coat. And now I'm just going to mix up a little bit of paint to do over the top. So I'm going to, because I just want it a little bit shimmery, I'm going to add a little bit of the silver mica, the liquid micas from Crystalac. And I'm just going to do a small amount. We really don't need a whole lot of paint to cover this, so just maybe 2 little scoops into my mixing container. And then I'm going to add some black gloss. Now you just want to roll it to incorporate the pigment into the clear coat that's in there. If you don't have black gloss, you can use the gloss Brite Tone or Extreme Protection with some black pigment to get the same effect. Or you could mix it and get gray using Universal White. So I'm going to add just a little bit of black gloss to my container and mix it up. Now the silver isn't going to show too much. It's just going to give it a nice little shimmer. And then we're also going to add some glitter additive to the very top of it as well. So I have it mixed really well, and then I'm just going to paint it. I'm going to start with a thin coat. It'll probably be pretty streaky. This does self-level, and I also am going to make sure I get the edges at this point so that I have a nice finished product. And this is thin, so we don't have to worry about finding the vinyl. That won't be an issue. So here is our paint. And then I'm just going to use a tack-on brush. You can use a fluffy blush brush as well. And then I'm just going to put a little bit on and paint.
Yeah. Yep. So the black gloss is pretty translucent because it doesn't have any paint base in it to make it opaque. So it'll take a few coats, but it will build on itself pretty nicely. So this first layer, I'm not too worried about having a full coverage appearance as much as I am just looking at getting all of the nooks and crannies covered. And then I'll go over the sides at the end because that will help if there's any sort of product that kind of drips down, then I'll brush those out. Plus I can use the sides to kind of hold it as I'm painting. Okay, so I'm going to do this first layer horizontally, and then I'll finish the next layer vertically just so that it does get into all of the cross hatching. So then just a tiny bit and go around my edges. And you can see how much darker that looks because it's going over the white, solid white canvas. So I'm just going to keep doing that around all of my edges, and then I'm going to let this dry for 4 hours, and then I'll come back and build another layer. Before applying your second layer, make sure that you mix up the mica and the black gloss well to reincorporate, and then just brush it on your canvas as you did for the first layer, making sure that the paint is deposited into the crevices of the canvas. You can apply your second and third layer a little bit thicker than your first. Let your layers dry for a minimum of 4 hours, and then repeat these steps until you get your desired coverage. This one needed 3 total layers of black gloss to get my solid coverage. Don't worry about trying to get the paint totally streak-free when you're painting. Just like with tumblers, the gloss will self-level and it will smooth out as it dries. So just make sure you're applying it evenly around the canvas. It's also a good idea to brush the sides of the canvas last to ensure that any paint dripping from applying it is smoothed out around the edges and you aren't left with paint drips on your canvas. Let your final layer of paint dry for a minimum of 4 hours before moving on to the next step, which is removing the vinyl stencil. And so now I'm ready to peel my vinyl. I like to use just a regular sewing pin, I don't know if that will focus, to do this rather than a weeding tool. I just feel like it gives me a little bit more control, and because this is a fabric material, you want to be careful not to pierce the fabric. So I just kind of go at it like at a 45-degree angle or so just to try and get the vinyl to pick up without getting the fabric underneath. And then I can just peel it off and expose the design underneath. So I will go ahead and get rid of all of this vinyl now. All of our vinyl peeled off, and our next step is going to be to add some clear coat over it. Now I am going to add some additional metallic decals, just a couple hearts in a few places as an accent, but I want to go ahead and add the sparkle in my clear coat first before I add those, because otherwise it tends to look just like gritty on the metallic, the glitter does over it. So let's do that first. So let's mix it up. Let me move my sign for a second, and I will just get another container to mix my Brite Tone in. Let me find a container, there we go. And I'm going to use some of the Cullen glitter additive from Feather Bear Bling. It's just a super microfine additive, and it works really well with Brite Tone because it doesn't have, it's so fine that it doesn't sink to the bottom of the Brite Tone. So I'm just gonna use a little scooper and put some in there. There we go. And then I will go ahead and add just a little bit of the liquid mica to it as well to give some extra shine. So I'll add that in. And then I will add some Brite Tone, and I'm going to make enough to do about 2 to 3 coats. You can skip this step if you want and just go straight to your Extreme Protection or Brite Tone. I'm going to use EP for this. So I'm just going to mix it up. I need to fill it up soon. I'm just going to add a small amount first so that I can get it all incorporated really well. Ooh, that's really pretty. Once you have your shimmer mixed into your clear coat, apply it to your canvas just like the previous steps with the black glass. I wound up only needing 1 coat of the shimmer mix because of how sparkly it was. Allow it to dry for 4 hours before moving on to the next step.
And now for the last few steps, I'm going to add these decals. So I cut these out in a matte pink metallic vinyl, and it's an adhesive vinyl, so I'm just going to stick them on, and I cut them out close to each other and then just hand place them since they're just kind of sporadic throughout. But if you use the SVG for this, it'll show you the placement of them. I'm going to do a little one here. And then right there. So I'm just going to put them on and burnish them down a bit. And then the last step is to just add a couple coats of Brite Tone or Extreme Protection to protect this. So again, you can use Extreme Protection as your final layers on these because they're not going to take the wear and tear like cups do. So Extreme Protection works really well for canvas signs and wood signs. So I'm just going to use my brush and do 2 layers of it and then let it dry a few hours between each layer and we will be all done. You can see the shimmer from the glitter. I zoom in a bit, you can see the sparkles and it will be a nice cute sign to hang up for Valentine's Day.
Here is our completed sign after the last 2 coats of Extreme Protection. Make sure you check out the link in the description for purchasing the SVG that I used in this project. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions, and don't forget to subscribe if you want more videos. Thanks so much for watching, and happy crafting!